1241 CE, the plains south of Pest, Hungary, a Mongol two-man, 10,000 horsemen, thunders across the grassland at full gallop, their target a retreating Byzantine mercenary force that had been attached to the Hungarian defence. The Byzantine commander has barely 300 men. No walls, no fortifications, just open ground and certain annihilation. Except the Mongols never reach them. The first rank of horses goes down in a chaos of screaming animals and tumbling riders, then the second rank, then the third. In under 2 minutes, the most feared cavalry force on earth grinds to a complete halt, and not a single Byzantine soldier has drawn a weapon. Scattered across that Hungarian field, invisible in the tall grass, lies the simplest and most devastatingly effective area denial weapon the medieval world had ever seen: the four-pointed iron caltrop. The problem facing every empire that didn't have horse archers was straightforward and terrifying. Steppe nomads, whether Huns, Avars or Mongols, could cover 60 miles in a day, attack from any direction, and disengage before heavy infantry could even form ranks. At Liegnitz in 1241, the Mongols destroyed a combined Polish-German army of 25,000 men, while suffering minimal casualties themselves. The conventional defensive response was static fortifications, but you cannot fortify an entire frontier. At Moe, just days after the incident near Pest, the Mongols annihilated 50,000 Hungarians by simply going around their defensive positions. European knights in full armour were formidable in close combat but useless if they couldn't catch their enemy. Byzantine cataphracts, the empire's own heavy cavalry, faced the same limitation. Speed was everything on the Eurasian steppe, and if you couldn't match it, you lost. Byzantine military treatises from the 10th century forward obsessed over this same tactical nightmare. The Strategikon, attributed to Emperor Maurice in the late 6th century, devoted entire chapters to fighting mounted archers, and every solution required either matching their mobility or forcing them to fight on your terms. But how do you force a cavalry army to fight when their entire tactical doctrine is built on choosing when and where to engage? What Byzantine military engineers needed was a weapon that didn't require soldiers to operate it, that covered vast areas with minimal resources, that worked equally well whether you were present or not, and that turned the enemy's greatest advantage, their horses, into a fatal vulnerability. They needed something that had existed in various forms since ancient times, but that they would refine into a precise instrument of strategic denial. The caltrop itself wasn't a Byzantine invention. Four-pointed iron spikes designed to maim horses appeared in Roman accounts, and probably earlier. Vegetius, writing in the 4th century, mentions tribuli used against cavalry. The genius wasn't in inventing the caltrop. The genius was in understanding exactly how to manufacture, deploy, and integrate it into a comprehensive defensive strategy that could neutralize the tactical advantages of horse armies without requiring numerical superiority or matching their mobility. The Byzantine metallurgical approach to caltrop production represented a careful balance between effectiveness and economy. Each caltrop consisted of 4 iron spikes arranged tetrahedrally, a geometric shape ensuring that one spike always points upward regardless of how the device lands. The spikes measured between 2 and 3 inches in length, long enough to penetrate the hardened keratin of a horse's hoof and reach the sensitive laminar tissue beneath, but not so long that the caltrop became unwieldy to transport or deploy. The iron used was medium carbon steel, harder than wrought iron but not as brittle as high carbon steel that might shatter on impact with stone. Byzantine smiths forged these by the thousands in state-run fabricae, the imperial armament workshops that produced standardized military equipment across the empire. Production records from Constantinople's workshops, fragmentary but illuminating, suggest a single skilled smith could produce approximately 60 caltrops per day, using a specialized two-piece mold technique that allowed for rapid casting followed by minimal finishing work. This meant a workshop with 10 smiths could produce 600 caltrops daily, enough to deny 2 miles of open ground within a week. The weight mattered enormously for logistics. Each caltrop weighed approximately 3 ounces. A soldier could carry 200 in a standard leather provision bag, enough to defend a 100-yard frontage, and a single pack mule could transport nearly 4,000, sufficient to block a quarter-mile corridor. This portability transformed the caltrop from a static defensive measure into a mobile area denial system that could be deployed rapidly in response to enemy movement. If you're finding these deep dives into how medieval empires solved seemingly impossible tactical problems interesting, subscribing helps the channel continue uncovering these forgotten innovations that changed history. The first documented large-scale Byzantine deployment against steppe cavalry occurred in 1078 near Nicomedia, during the chaotic civil wars that fragmented the empire after Manzikert. The rebel general Nicephorus Botaniates, facing a force of Seljuk Turkic cavalry hired by his rival, ordered caltrops spread across the approaches to his encampment under cover of darkness. Contemporary sources, particularly Michael Attaliates, who was present with Botaniates' forces, described the Turkish cavalry launching a dawn attack and suffering immediate catastrophic casualties. Horses went down across the entire front rank. The Turks withdrew, attempted to flank, and encountered the same defences on both sides. By mid-morning they'd lost perhaps 15% of their mounted strength without forcing any engagement with Byzantine troops. They withdrew entirely within 2 days, but the more strategically significant deployment came during the Fourth Crusade's aftermath, when Byzantine successor states fought for survival against Latin crusaders and resurgent Turkish powers. Theodore Lascaris, establishing what would become the Empire of Nicaea, used caltrops extensively to defend mountain passes in western Anatolia against both Latin cavalry and Turkish raiders. The Battle of Antioch-on-the-Meander in 1211 provides the clearest tactical picture. Lascaris, with roughly 8,000 troops, faced a combined Seljuk and Latin force of at least 12,000. He chose a battlefield bracketed by marshland on one side and forested hills on the other, leaving 3 viable approach routes. His engineers seeded 2 of those routes with caltrops during the night, covering approximately 300 yards of frontage with an estimated 40,000 caltrops, dense enough that a horse could not cross without encountering multiple devices. The enemy commanders, unaware of the caltrops, sent their cavalry down what appeared to be the clearest approaches. Both forces hit the caltrop fields simultaneously. The Seljuk contingent lost cohesion immediately as horses fell and riders scattered. The Latin knights, more heavily armoured and riding larger destriers, actually suffered worse. A fully armoured knight on a falling horse often sustained serious injuries from the fall itself, and the weight of their armour made remounting under combat conditions nearly impossible. Lascaris then concentrated his entire force against the one untouched approach route, where the enemy, now fragmented and demoralised, could be defeated piecemeal. He won decisively, capturing several Latin nobles and scattering the Seljuk allies. The caltrops had effectively removed 2/3 of the enemy's tactical options before combat even began. The Mongol encounters with Byzantine caltrop tactics, though less thoroughly documented than we might wish, appear to have occurred primarily during the 1240-50s, when Mongol forces operated in Eastern Europe and occasionally clashed with Byzantine mercenary units or allied forces. The incident near Pest mentioned at the opening, while not detailed in Mongol sources, appears in Hungarian chronicles that noted Byzantine troops employed iron stars scattered on the ground that stopped Mongol pursuit. The principle was identical to earlier deployments: deny mobility, force the enemy to fight on foot or withdraw entirely, and eliminate the tactical advantage of mounted archery. Mongol doctrine relied absolutely on mobility and the ability to execute coordinated movements by multiple units simultaneously. Caltrops didn't just injure horses, they shattered unit cohesion and forced commanders to choose between unacceptable options, dismount and lose their primary advantage, or withdraw and cede the field. When compared to contemporary area denial methods used by other civilizations, Byzantine caltrops demonstrated several key advantages. Chinese forces facing steppe nomads relied heavily on crossbow formations and fortified positions connected by walls, the ultimate expression being the Great Wall system itself. This worked for strategic defense of fixed borders, but required enormous resources and permanent garrisons. The Song dynasty experimented with their own caltrop designs, documented in the Wujing Zongyao military treatise from 1044, but Chinese versions tended to be larger and heavier, designed to stop armoured cavalry rather than the lighter steppe horses. This made them less portable and more expensive to produce in quantity. Islamic armies, particularly the Abbasids and later the Mamluks, favoured different solutions to the cavalry problem. They developed sophisticated counter-cavalry tactics, using their own mounted archers, and focused on matching steppe mobility rather than denying it. When they did use caltrops, typically during sieges or defensive operations, They often employed larger anti-personnel versions meant to slow infantry assaults, rather than stop cavalry charges. The Mamluk Furusiya literature mentions caltrops primarily in siege contexts, suggesting they saw limited field application in Islamic military practice. European armies of the same period rarely used caltrops systematically. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 saw Scottish forces dig concealed pits across cavalry approaches, but this was labour-intensive and location-specific. Some Italian city-states experimented with caltrop deployment during the communal conflicts of the 13th century, possibly learning the technique from contact with Byzantine refugees after Constantinople's fall. But European military culture generally favoured direct confrontation and viewed area denial weapons as somehow less honourable than meeting enemies in open combat. This cultural preference cost them dearly when facing more pragmatic opponents. The manufacturing scale of Byzantine caltrop production, while impossible to quantify precisely, can be estimated from logistical records and defensive deployments. The empire at its 11th century height maintained perhaps 20 major fabricae producing military equipment. If even half dedicated partial capacity to caltrop production during periods of steppe pressure, daily output could have reached 3,000 units. Over a campaigning season of 6 months, that's over 500,000 caltrops, enough to defend every major pass and approach road in Anatolia multiple times over. Archaeological evidence supports large-scale production. Excavations at 11th century Byzantine military sites in Anatolia have recovered caltrops in quantities suggesting they were considered standard equipment rather than specialised tools. A defensive position near Dorylaeum yielded over 200 intact caltrops, and that's after a millennium of scavenging and metal recycling. The empire likely produced millions of caltrops between the 10th and 13th centuries. Their relatively simple construction meant production could scale rapidly during emergencies, and their durability meant they could be recovered and reused after battles. Soldiers detailed to collect caltrops after engagements could often recover 70 to 80% of deployed devices if they controlled the battlefield, making them remarkably cost-effective compared to expendable weapons like arrows. The tactical effectiveness record of caltrops in Byzantine service appears in military manuals and strategic treatises throughout the empire's middle and late periods. The 10th century Silage Tacticorum explicitly recommends caltrop deployment against nomadic peoples who place their confidence in swift horses. The text provides specific deployment guidance, evening placement under cover of darkness, spacing of approximately 1 caltrop per square yard in dense configurations or 1 per 2 square yards for economy, and marking of safe approach corridors for friendly forces. This last point reveals sophisticated tactical integration. Byzantine commanders didn't simply scatter caltrops randomly. They created controlled environments where enemy options were constrained to channels that Byzantine forces could defend with conventional troops, effectively using caltrops to shape the battlefield geometry. Success rates are harder to quantify. Medieval sources rarely provide the statistical data we'd prefer, but the continued emphasis on caltrop production and deployment across 3 centuries suggests battlefield effectiveness. Commanders are pragmatic. They don't waste resources on ineffective weapons. The caltrop's persistence in Byzantine military doctrine, even as other weapons and tactics evolved, indicates they consistently delivered tactical results. The technological influence of Byzantine caltrops extended well beyond the empire's frontiers. Crusaders returning to Western Europe after extended contact with Byzantine military practices brought knowledge of systematic caltrop use back with them. By the 14th century, French and English military texts began discussing caltrop deployment, though never with the same sophistication as Byzantine sources. The Mongols themselves, after their European campaigns, appear to have adopted caltrops into their own defensive repertoire. Yuan dynasty Chinese texts mention Mongol forces using iron thorns to protect encampments, a practice not documented in earlier Mongol armies. This suggests technological transfer from the Western campaigns. The principle of area denial weapons that separate an enemy from his tactical advantages would evolve into later innovations. The Czech wagon forts that defended against cavalry, the Spanish sword and buckler men who countered pike formations, eventually the landmines and barbed wire of industrial warfare. The caltrop represented an early recognition that in war the right tool applied at the right place could neutralize overwhelming force through simple physics and clever logistics. That Hungarian field south of Pest in 1241, where Mongol horses founded on iron spikes scattered by Byzantine hands, illustrates a truth that empires learned slowly and forgot quickly. Technological sophistication isn't always about complexity. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that denies your enemy the ability to use his. The Byzantine caltrop didn't win battles through decisive blows or dramatic charges. It won by making cavalry armies fight as infantry, by turning their speed into a liability, by letting 300 men hold ground against 10,000 not through valour, but through engineering. Those simple four-pointed iron stars weighing 3 ounces each, manufactured by the thousands in Constantinople's workshops and scattered across Anatolian plains and Balkan valleys, stopped more cavalry attacks than any shield wall or pike square could match. They remained in Byzantine arsenals until the empire's final collapse, outlasting the Mongols who threatened it and the Crusaders who wounded it. In the calculus of medieval warfare where mobility determined survival, the caltrops were the equation that didn't balance, and that's exactly why they worked.